The orphan girl saved a wounded wolf. Days later, the Alpha King called her mate. But she had no idea that the wolf she saved that night was the most feared king in the entire kingdom, and she certainly didn't know that saving his life would put a target on her back. So here's the question. What would you do if the helpless wolf you rescued in secret suddenly stood before you as the ruthless Alpha King and claimed you as his mate in front of his entire court? Wren Calloway was an orphan. Nobody important. Nobody powerful. Nobody who would come looking for her if she disappeared. She had spent her entire life surviving on scraps, working for every meal, and learning never to expect kindness from anyone. Until one freezing night, she found a massive silver wolf dying in the snow. He was covered in blood. His breathing was fading, and every warning she had ever heard told her to run. But Wren couldn't leave him there. So she dragged the wounded creature through the snow, carried him into her tiny shed, and spent the entire night fighting to keep him alive. She didn't ask who he was. She didn't ask where he came from. She didn't expect anything in return. She only wanted to save a life. What she didn't know was that she had just saved the life of the Alpha King. 3 days later, royal soldiers stormed into her village. They found the evidence. They found the blood. And they found Wren. Before she could understand what was happening, the orphan girl was dragged away in chains and taken to the king's fortress. She thought she was being taken there to die. She was wrong. Because when the enormous fortress doors opened, the Alpha King walked toward her. He was cold, powerful, terrifying. The same man whose name made entire packs tremble. He looked at Wren and suddenly stopped. His expression changed. His eyes widened, as if he had just seen the woman he had been searching for his entire life. Then, in front of his soldiers, in front of his council, and in front of everyone who expected him to punish her, the ruthless Alpha King whispered one word, mate. The entire court went silent, but Wren didn't understand. She didn't know what a mate bond meant. She didn't know why the king was looking at her like that, and she certainly didn't know why some of the people standing behind him suddenly looked terrified. Because saving the wounded wolf wasn't the real mystery. The real mystery was why the Alpha King had been attacked in the first place, and why the moment he found his mate, powerful people inside his kingdom suddenly wanted her dead. And Wren was about to discover that she wasn't just an orphan girl who happened to save a wounded wolf. She was the woman who could change the entire kingdom. If you want to see how far this story goes, subscribe now and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I would love to say hello and find out how far our story has traveled to reach you. Chapter 1: The Wolf in the Snow. Fern Hollow sat at the edge of the Ashgrave territory, the way a forgotten coin sits at the bottom of a well, present but never counted. Wren had lived there for 20 winters, 19 of them without parents, in a shed behind the miller's house that she had earned the right to sleep in by working harder than anyone thought an orphan girl should have to. She had learned early that survival was not a gift. It was a debt she paid every single day, in firewood gathered before dawn, in mending done by candlelight, in silence kept when silence was safer than the truth. She did not complain. Complaining had never once put food on a table. That evening the cold came in sharper than usual, biting through her cloak as she picked her way along the tree line collecting kindling. The forest here belonged to no one, and everyone. Villagers avoided it after dark, certain that the king's wolves patrolled its edges, watching for trespassers who wandered too close to territory that was not theirs. Wren had never been afraid of the woods. She was more afraid of an empty stomach. She smelled the blood before she saw him, sharp and metallic against the clean, cold air. She followed it without thinking, the way hunger makes a person follow anything that might mean survival, and found him collapsed in a hollow beneath a fallen pine, a wolf larger than any she had ever seen, his silver coat matted dark and wet along one flank. His breathing came in short, uneven pulls. His eyes were open. Every warning she had grown up with told her to leave. A wolf that size could take her arm off before she took 2 steps back. But his eyes held something she recognized. Not the blank hunger of an animal, but the exhausted awareness of something that knew exactly how much trouble it was in and had no strength left to hide it. "You're not going to hurt me," she said quietly, more to convince herself than him. "You don't have the strength to." He did not growl. He did not move at all, except to let his head fall back against the snow, as if giving up the fight was easier than continuing it. The forest around them held its usual winter stillness, the kind that settled so deep into a place that even the wind seemed to pass through it carefully. Wren crouched beside him in that stillness for longer than was wise, weighing the sensible thing against the thing she could not quite stop herself from doing. Sensible was walking away. Sensible had kept her alive for 19 years without parents, without land, without anyone whose obligation it was to catch her if she fell. But Sensible had never once made her feel like a person worth anything beyond her usefulness, and something about the way this creature had simply let his guard fall in front of her, as if trusting a stranger was the only option left to him, cracked something open that Sensible could not close back up. She thought, briefly, of her mother, who had died with a stranger's hand in hers because no one else had been willing to sit with a fever that dangerous. Wren had been young enough then to only half understand what kindness cost the person offering it. She understood now, kneeling in the snow beside a dying animal 3 times her size, and she chose to pay that cost anyway. The pines above them creaked under a fresh gust of wind, scattering loose snow across the wolf's silver flank, and Wren pulled her own thin cloak tighter without thinking to spare any part of it for herself. She had grown used to the cold the way a person grows used to any constant hardship, not by learning to like it, but by learning that complaining about it changed nothing. What she had not grown used to, in 19 years of careful, guarded survival, was the strange pull she felt to stay beside something that could not repay her, could not thank her, and might not even live long enough to remember that she had tried. Wren had spent her whole life being the one nobody chose to help. She understood, in a way she could not fully explain, what it looked like when a creature had run out of anyone willing to try. She dropped her bundle of firewood, tore a strip from the hem of her cloak, and pressed it hard against the wound along his side. He was heavier than anything she had ever moved, but desperation is its own kind of strength. She half dragged, half coaxed him through the trees, toward the shed she called home, stopping twice to catch her breath, once to whisper an apology for how roughly she had to pull him. By the time she got him through the door and onto a bed of old straw, her arms shook from the effort, and her hands were slick with blood that was not her own. She did not know what she had just done, or who she had just saved, or what it would cost her. She only knew that leaving him to die in the snow was not a decision she could have lived with. She barred the shed door as best she could with a broken plank, though she doubted it would stop anything determined to get in, and knelt beside him in the dim light to properly assess the damage for the first time. The wound along his flank was deep but clean, the kind left by a blade rather than an animal's claws, and the realization settled uneasily in her stomach even as she worked. Whatever had attacked him had not been another beast defending its territory. It had been something far more deliberate, and she found herself wondering, with a chill that had nothing to do with the weather outside, exactly what kind of enemy a creature this large could have made for itself. Outside, the wind picked up, scattering her forgotten firewood across a forest that already knew far more than she did about what, and who she had just carried home. Chapter 2. The Guest Who Would Not Speak. The wolf did not die, though for the first hour, Wren was certain he would. She worked by the light of a single tallow candle, cleaning the wound as best she knew how, packing it with the same dried yarrow her mother had once used on split knuckles and burned fingers before fever took both her parents in a single bad winter. She talked to him while she worked, the way she sometimes talked to herself when the shed grew too quiet. She was not foolish enough to think he understood her. She simply needed to fill the silence with something other than fear. "You picked a poor place to nearly die," she told him, tying off a strip of cloth around his ribs. "I don't have much, but I suppose neither do you, right now." His ear flicked at the sound of her voice. That was the first thing that unsettled her. Not that he understood her exactly, but that he was listening. As the night wore on, his breathing steadied. His eyes, a strange pale amber that caught the candlelight like a struck flame, followed her every movement around the small room. There was nothing wild in that gaze. I was careful, measuring, almost embarrassed, if a wolf could be embarrassed, at being seen so weak. She changed his dressing twice more before the fire burned low, each time speaking softly to warn him before she touched the wound, as though he could understand the courtesy, even if he could not answer it. By the second change, he had stopped flinching at her hands entirely, and once, when her fingers brushed too near a tender spot along his ribs, he simply exhaled through his nose and let his eyes fall half-closed, trusting her to finish what she had started. It was such a small thing, that trust, and yet it settled into her chest with more weight than she expected from a creature she had known for only a handful of hours. Wren had grown up around animals, the miller's dogs, the goats she milked for extra coin, and none of them had ever looked at her the way this one did. Like he was memorizing her. She kept working anyway, because stopping to wonder about it felt like a distraction she could not afford while his wound was still open. She boiled water over the low fire, tore more strips from clothing she could not easily replace, and pressed a cool cloth to his brow when the fever briefly threatened to climb. Somewhere in the slow rhythm of that work, the strangeness of caring for a wolf twice her size stopped feeling strange at all, and simply felt like the next necessary thing. It occurred to her, well past midnight, that she had not once been frightened of him. Not really. Not the way the stories had promised she should be. Fear required distance, and there had been none between them since the moment she found him. She wondered, drowsy and half-dreaming beside the fire, whether that meant something about him, or simply something about her. That she had never learned how to be afraid of a creature that needed her more than it could ever hurt her. She told herself it meant nothing. Wounded creatures often fixed on whoever was closest when the pain was worse. She had read that once, in a book borrowed and never returned. It did not stop her from feeling, every time their eyes met, that something larger than the moment was passing between them. Near midnight, exhaustion finally pulled her down beside the low fire, and she allowed herself to rest one hand against his uninjured side, feeling the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing beneath her palm. It was the only warmth she had had in months that did not come from a hard day's work. "Whatever you are," she murmured, half asleep, "thank you for not eating me." If a wolf could have laughed, she thought later, that might have been the closest a creature ever came to it. A low, huffed breath through his nose that was almost, impossibly, amused. She dozed in fits through what remained of the night, waking every so often to check his breathing, each time finding him steadier than the last, until sometime near the deepest, darkest hour before dawn, she allowed herself to fall properly asleep, her back against the cold wood of the shed wall, one hand still resting loosely against his side, as though even in sleep, some part of her refused to let go of the thread connecting them. She dreamed, briefly and without much clarity, of standing in a hall far grander than anything Fern Hollow had ever offered, surrounded by banners she did not recognize, a pair of amber eyes watching her from across a crowded room. She woke before she could make sense of it, the dream already dissolving the way dreams do, leaving behind only a faint unease she could not name and did not have the luxury of examining for long. Before the sun had fully cleared the tree line, she made herself rise and go through the motions of an ordinary morning, milking the miller's goats, mending a torn hem she had been putting off for a week, anything to keep her hands too busy for her mind to wander back to a shed that now felt far emptier than it had any right to. It did not work particularly well. Every quiet moment found her thinking of amber eyes and steady breathing, of a trust she had not asked for and could not quite explain, and she caught herself, more than once that day, glancing toward the tree line as though a silver wolf might simply reappear if she looked at the right moment. She woke before dawn to an empty shed. The straw where he had lain still held the shape of him, and a faint smear of blood marked the doorway where he had pushed his way out into the dark. There was no sign of the wolf anywhere in the pale gray light creeping over Fern Hollow. Only silence, and the strange, hollow feeling of having been chosen for something she did not understand, and then left without explanation. Wren stood in the doorway a long while, arms wrapped around herself against the cold, telling herself it did not matter. He was a wild animal. He owed her nothing, and she had expected nothing in return. She almost believed it. Chapter 3. Boots at the Door. 3 days passed before the riders came, and in that time Wren tried, without much success, to forget the wolf entirely. She could not explain why his absence sat in her chest like an unanswered question. She had nursed injured creatures before, a lame goat, a crow with a broken wing, and never once gave them a second thought once they were gone. This felt different, and she did not like that it felt different, because feelings like that were a luxury an orphan girl could not afford. The riders arrived at midday, when most of Fern Hollow was occupied with work that could not wait for royal business. Wren heard the horses before she saw them, a dozen at least, moving with the disciplined weight of soldiers, not merchants or travelers passing through. By the time she reached the square, armored men in the king's black and silver were already moving door to door, and the village's usual noise had dropped into a thin, frightened hush. "There was a beast injured near this village 4 nights past," one of the guards announced to the gathered crowd, his voice carrying easily over the silence. "A creature, under the king's protection. Anyone found harboring it, or aiding it, will answer for treason against the crown." Wren's stomach dropped. She kept her face still, the way she had learned to keep it still through every hard thing life had handed her, and told herself the blood-stained rag she had buried behind the shed would never be found. She was wrong. A guard emerged from the direction of the miller's property holding her ruined cloak, the hem torn and stiff with old blood, discovered where she had carelessly left it drying on a fence post instead of burning it like she should have. "This one," the guard said, and pointed directly at her. For one long breath, Wren considered denying it outright. She had survived this long by knowing exactly which fights were worth losing, and a public denial in front of armed soldiers holding the evidence in their own hands was not a fight she could win. She let the breath go, along with any hope that this would end quietly. The square turned to look at her the way a crowd looks at anyone singled out for disaster, some with pity, most with relief that it was not them. Wren did not run. Running was an admission, and worse, it was pointless. There was nowhere in Fern Hollow that a dozen mounted soldiers could not reach. "I found an animal in the woods," she said, keeping her voice steady, even as 2 guards closed in on either side of her. "I helped it because it was dying. I did not know it belonged to anyone." "It belongs to the king," the lead guard said flatly, "and you will explain yourself to him directly." They bound her wrists in front of her, not cruelly, but without any gentleness either, and led her toward a waiting cart. The miller watched from his doorway and said nothing. No one said anything. That was the quiet, ordinary cruelty of a place like Fern Hollow. Not that people were unkind, but that kindness was a risk few could afford when soldiers were watching. A few of the younger children peered out from behind their parents' legs, watching her march past with the wide, uncomprehending stare children reserve for things they know are bad without understanding why. One of them, a girl no older than 7 who Wren had once carried home after a fall near the well, lifted a small hand in a hesitant wave before her mother pulled it back down. Wren did not blame her for that. She had learned the same lesson herself, long before she had the words to explain it. That in a village this poor, survival sometimes meant looking away from someone else's misfortune before it became your own. The cart itself smelled of old hay and colder still of fear, and Wren spent the first stretch of the ride simply trying to steady her breathing, watching Fern Hollow's rooftops shrink behind her one by one. She thought of the wolf then, sharply and without warning, wondering whether he had made it wherever he was going, whether the king he apparently belonged to had any notion of the debt owed to a girl now riding toward judgment in his name. One of the guards riding beside the cart glanced at her more than once during that first hour, an older man with tired eyes who seemed less interested in her crime than in the strangeness of dragging an orphan girl halfway across the territory over a wolf. He said nothing to her directly, but she noticed he did not tighten her bindings again when they loosened slightly with the cart's motion, a small, silent mercy she chose not to question. By the time night fell over the road, the fear that had gripped her in the square had settled into something quieter and more useful, a cold, careful determination to survive whatever waited at the end of this journey, the same way she had survived every other hardship life had handed her. She had no allies waiting for her at the fortress, no family name to invoke, nothing but her own wits and the stubborn refusal to be broken by circumstances she had never asked for. It would have to be enough. It always had been before. As the cart lurched into motion, carrying her away from the only home she had ever known, Wren watched Fern Hollow shrink behind her, the miller's roof, the well she had drawn water from every morning of her life, the small shed that had never once felt like enough, and now felt like everything she was losing. No one waved. No one called after her. That, more than the ropes at her wrists, was the thing that stayed with her longest on the road ahead. She allowed herself exactly one thought she would not have permitted a week earlier. If the wolf she had saved truly belonged to the king, then somewhere behind the walls she was being dragged toward, he was alive. Whatever came next, at least that much of what she had done, had not been wasted. She held on to that thought the way she had once held on to scraps of hope through hard winters, carefully, without expecting too much from it, but unwilling to let it go entirely. Whatever waited for her at the end of this road, she would meet it having already done one good thing that could not be undone, no matter what judgment came next. Chapter 4. The Road to Ashgrave Keep. The journey to Ashgrave Keep took the better part of 2 days, over roads that grew steadily narrower and colder the closer they came to the mountains. Wren spent the hours watching the landscape change, from the open, working fields she knew, to something wilder and older, forests thick enough to swallow sunlight whole. She had heard stories of the keep her whole life, the way every commoner in the Ashgrave territory had, a fortress built into the mountain itself, home to a king who ruled not just a kingdom but a pack, whose word could end a life as easily as a spare one. Stories, she had always assumed, grew larger with every telling. Along the way, the guards spoke little to her, though she caught fragments of their conversation when they thought she was asleep against the cart's wooden rail. Talk of a hunting party sent out days earlier that had never returned intact, of a king who had shifted and vanished without explanation and come back changed. Wren listened to every word she could catch, piecing together a story that felt, with each new fragment, less like coincidence and more like something she had already lived through from the other side. She did not sleep much, in the end. The cold kept her awake as much as the questions did, and by the second night she had stopped pretending either would let her rest. They had not grown large enough. When the keep finally came into view at the top of a long stone approach, Wren understood for the first time how small her entire life had been compared to the world she was being pulled into. Towers of gray stone rose against a sky the color of old iron, banners bearing a snarling wolf sigil snapping in the wind above battlements lined with archers. Torches burned along the walls despite the daylight, as if the fortress itself refused to let any part of it fall into shadow. Guard wolves paced the courtyard below, massive and scarred, watching the approaching cart with an attentiveness that made her skin prickle. These were not the half-starved strays that sometimes wandered near Fernhollow. These were creatures bred, or born, for war. Wren counted 7 of them before she lost track, each one larger than any dog she had ever seen, their coats ranging from deep charcoal to a pale, almost ghostly gray. One lifted its head as the cart rolled past, amber eyes tracking her with an intelligence that unsettled her more than any snarl could have. She thought, absurdly, of the wolf in her shed, and wondered whether these creatures answered to him the same way a village answered to its lord, or something closer, something bound tighter than mere loyalty. "Head down," one of her guards muttered, as the cart rolled through the outer gate. "It goes easier if you don't stare." Wren did not put her head down. She had spent her whole life being told to keep her eyes lowered, her voice quiet, her presence small enough not to inconvenience anyone. She had done it because it kept her fed and unnoticed. It would not save her now, and if these were to be her final hours, she intended to meet them with her chin level. The cart stopped in a wide stone courtyard beneath the largest of the towers. Soldiers lined the steps in formation, and beyond them, carved into the great doors of the keep itself, the same wolf sigil watched over everything like an unblinking eye. She was pulled down from the cart, her wrists still bound, and made to stand at the base of the steps while a runner was sent ahead. The cold here felt different than the cold in Fernhollow, sharper, more deliberate, as though even the weather answered to someone. Wren looked up at the fortress towering over her and allowed herself, for just a moment, to be afraid. Then she straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and waited for whatever judgment was coming down those stone steps to reach her. Whatever happened next, she decided, she would not meet it on her knees. The runner returned faster than she expected, murmuring something to the guard captain that made the entire courtyard shift its attention toward the great doors. Whatever was coming, it was coming now, and Wren made herself breathe slowly, deliberately, the way she had taught herself to do through every hard moment life had handed her before this one. Chapter 5. The King's Judgment. The doors of the keep opened before Wren had finished steadying her breath, and the king came down the steps himself, which the murmur among the soldiers told her was not usual. He was not what she had imagined. Stories painted kings as distant, ornamental things, wrapped in velvet and gold. Roan Ashgrave wore blackened steel etched with running wolves, a cloak that moved like smoke behind him, and an expression carved from something far harder than velvet. He was tall enough that she had to tilt her head to hold his gaze, and she did, because looking away now would undo the only thing she had left to offer, her own composure. Around them, the courtyard had gone still in the particular way large crowds do when they sense a spectacle about to unfold. Soldiers stood at attention along the steps, their expressions carefully blank, while a handful of robed council members watched from the shadow of the doorway with far less discretion, clearly eager to see how their king handled a commoner accused of interfering in royal matters. "This is the one," a guard reported, "found harboring the injured animal near Fern Hollow." The king's eyes moved over her once. Quickly, the assessment of a man cataloging a problem rather than a person. Then he stopped. Really looked. Something flickered behind his expression, gone almost before Wren registered it. "You will explain," he said, his voice low and controlled in a way that was somehow more unsettling than shouting would have been, "why you thought it wise to interfere with a creature under royal protection." "I did not know what he was," Wren answered, and if her voice shook, she refused to let it show. "I only knew he was dying, and I could not walk past that. You could have reported it, sent word. Instead, you hid a beast from the crown's own men for 3 days." "I hid a wounded animal from no one," she said, anger finally cutting through her fear. "I did not know there was a law requiring me to let something die in the snow because it might belong to someone important." A ripple moved through the watching court at that. A gasp from somewhere near the steps, the particular silence of people waiting to see a commoner punished for insolence. The king's jaw tightened, and he raised his hand, one finger extended toward her chest in open accusation, the gesture of a ruler about to pronounce a sentence he had already decided. "You will learn," he began. "The cost of—" He stopped. Wren watched it happen in real time, the way his whole body seemed to seize, his breath catching hard in his chest, his amber eyes flaring with something that was not anger at all. His outstretched hand trembled once before falling slowly to his side. The court around them fell utterly silent, sensing, before Wren did, that something had shifted in the air itself. "You're sent," he said, quieter now, almost to himself. "I know you're sent." Wren did not understand. She only knew that the fury that had filled the courtyard a moment ago had drained out of him entirely, replaced by something raw and unguarded that no king, she suspected, was meant to show in front of his own soldiers. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the exact moment recognition finished settling into his face. The shed, the candlelight, the hands that had packed yarrow into an open wound with more care than fear. "It was you," he said, "in Fern Hollow. You were the one who—" He did not finish the sentence. Instead, in front of his entire court, in front of guards who had been ready moments earlier to see her punished, Alpha King Roan Ashgrave said the one word that would upend everything either of them thought they understood about what came next. "Mate." For a moment, nobody in the courtyard moved at all, as though the word itself had frozen the air around it. Somewhere near the steps, a soldier's grip tightened audibly on his spear. Wren stood very still, her wrists still bound, watching the king she had believed, only moments earlier, was about to have her executed, stare at her instead, like a man who had just been handed something he did not know how to hold. She had no framework for what was happening. No one in Fern Hollow had ever spoken of kings recognizing orphan girls in courtyards full of soldiers, of fury collapsing into something unnamed in the space of a single breath. She only knew that the finger once pointed at her chest in accusation now hung uselessly at his side, and that every eye that had watched her with contempt moments earlier now watched her with something closer to disbelief. Somewhere behind the king, an older soldier leaned toward a younger one and murmured a single word Wren caught only in fragments, bonded, or perhaps bound, before both fell silent under a sharp look from their captain. She did not need the full word to understand its weight. Whatever had just passed between her and the king in front of his entire court, it was not something easily undone, and from the stunned faces surrounding her, it was not something that had happened within living memory either. She stood very still amid the wreckage of an accusation that had, in the space of a single breath, become something else entirely. and waited to see what the king himself would do with a truth even he seemed unprepared for. For his part, Roan looked like a man who had spent his whole reign preparing for battles and betrayals and had never once considered that the ground might shift beneath him in a way that had nothing to do with either. He drew a slow breath, visibly gathering himself the way she imagined he must before any difficult decision, and when he spoke again, his voice carried across the courtyard with the weight of a man determined not to let his own uncertainty show. Chapter 6. A Name Half Spoken. The word landed in the courtyard like a stone dropped into still water, and Ren watched the ripples move outward across every face turned toward them. She did not know what it meant, not fully, though something in the way the king's soldiers shifted uneasily, the way a few exchanged glances heavy with unspoken alarm, told her it meant far more than a simple word should. Somewhere behind the front ranks, a young guard dropped the hilt of his spear against the stone, the sound sharp enough to make several heads turn before he caught it and straightened again, red-faced. No one laughed. Ren understood, without being told, that whatever had just happened in front of them broke some rule far older than any law written down in the keep's records, and that everyone present would be repeating this moment to someone else before the sun set. "Your Grace!" A voice cut through the silence, sharp with barely restrained disapproval. A man in dark council robes had stepped forward from the crowd near the steps, older, narrow-faced, with the kind of stillness that came from decades spent choosing words carefully. Perhaps this is a conversation better held within the keep, rather than in front of half the garrison. The king did not look away from Ren. "This changes nothing about how she is treated, Magistrate Hale. It changes everything about who decides it. She harbored a royal beast from the crown's own men," the magistrate pressed. "Bond or not, that is a fact that does not simply vanish." "The beast was me," the king said flatly, and this time the silence that followed was absolute. "I do not require an explanation for my own injuries." Ren stood very still through all of it, wrists still bound, trying to piece together a truth too large to fit into the space of a single courtyard conversation. The wolf she had nursed through the night, whose breathing she had steadied with her own hand, had been this man the entire time. The king who had, moments ago, been prepared to sentence her for a crime that was, apparently, an act of mercy toward himself. "You could have told me," she said, before she could stop herself, ignoring the magistrate, ignoring the guards, ignoring every rule about how a commoner was meant to address a king. "I sat beside you half the night, not knowing whether you'd live. You could have said something before I was dragged here in chains." A few soldiers actually flinched at her tone. The king did not. "I could not speak," he said, "when I did not have a voice to speak with." Something almost like the ghost of amusement passed over his face, quickly buried beneath the weight of the situation. "You have every right to be angry with me. I would ask that you save it until your wrists are no longer bound." He turned to the nearest guard and gave the order himself, his voice returning to the command it had carried before, though something beneath it had softened. "Release her." "She is not a prisoner of this keep." "Then what is she?" Magistrate Hale asked, his tone edged with a question that was clearly meant as a warning rather than curiosity. The king's gaze returned to Ren, steady now, in a way it had not been since the moment recognition struck him. "That," he said, "is a matter for the court to accept, not question." As the ropes fell away from her wrists, Ren understood, with a clarity that settled cold and certain in her stomach, that whatever had happened between them in that courtyard had not ended her danger. It had only changed its shape. She rubbed absently at the marks the rope had left, watching Magistrate Hale's retreating back as he swept from the courtyard with the stiff, controlled walk of a man already planning his next move, rather than accepting the last one. Roan did not seem to notice, or if he did, he gave no sign of it, his attention fixed instead on making certain she was steady on her feet. Wren filed the magistrate's expression away regardless. She had spent a lifetime reading the faces of people who did not want to be read, and he had told her plainly enough that this was far from finished. Around them, the courtyard slowly began to empty, soldiers returning to their posts, servants hurrying off to spread the news to every corner of the keep before nightfall. Wren stood in the middle of the thinning crowd, feeling strangely untethered, as though the ground beneath her had shifted without her permission, and she had not yet found her footing on whatever new shape it had taken. A king had just claimed her in front of his entire court. She still did not fully understand what that meant, only that there would be no simply walking away from it now, even if some part of her still wished she could. Roan seemed to sense the direction of her thoughts, because he did not press her to speak further, only offered his arm toward the keep's doors, with none of the command that had colored his voice earlier that same afternoon. "You'll want food, and rest, and likely a great many answers I owe you," he said quietly, once they were far enough from the dispersing crowd that no one else could easily overhear. "I promise you all three, though I cannot promise the answers will be simple ones." "I've never had much use for simple," Wren said, and though her voice still carried the rasp of exhaustion, something in it had steadied. "Simple has never once been kind to me." Something that might have been the beginning of a smile passed briefly over his face, gone almost as quickly as it arrived, buried beneath the weight of everything still waiting to be explained. He led her through the great doors of the keep without another word, and Wren followed, aware of every curious glance from the servants they passed, aware, too, that whatever life she had known in Fern Hollow had ended somewhere on that road, replaced now by a future she had not chosen and could not yet begin to picture. Chapter 7. Chains of Silk. They gave her a room in the eastern wing of the keep, far grander than anything Wren had ever slept in, and it took her the better part of a day to stop expecting someone to tell her it was a mistake. A maid named Fen, quiet and kind, in a way that suggested she had survived the keep's politics by making herself useful rather than noticed, helped Wren into clothes that fit properly for the first time in years, and explained, in careful, patient terms, what a mate bond meant among the wolves of Ashgrave. "It's not a title given," Fen said, folding a length of gray wool over Wren's shoulders. "It's not chosen either. It simply happens, and once it does, there's no undoing it, not by the king himself." "That's meant to comfort me?" Wren asked. Fen's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "It's meant to explain why half the court downstairs is either terrified of you or furious about you, and why neither of those things is really about you at all." Wren turned that over in her mind for the rest of the day, through a meal she barely tasted, and a walk along a corridor lined with tapestries depicting battles she did not recognize. She paused before one of the largest of them, worn soft with age, showing a king she did not know locked in combat against a pack whose banners bore no crescent moon or crown, only a plain gray wolf standing alone against a field of red. Something about the image unsettled her in a way she could not immediately name, a familiarity she had no right to feel toward a battle fought generations before her birth. She did not linger on it long enough to ask herself why. She found the king on a balcony overlooking the training yard as evening fell, watching his soldiers below with the distracted attention of a man whose thoughts were elsewhere entirely. "You're staring," she said, coming to stand beside him. "I'm thinking," he corrected, glancing sideways at her before returning his gaze to the yard below, watching his soldiers train with an attention that clearly belonged somewhere else entirely. "And what are you thinking about?" "That I owe you an apology I don't know how to give properly." He said it plainly, without the practiced smoothness she might have expected from a king. "You saved my life expecting nothing, and I repaid you by nearly ending yours in front of my entire court. You didn't know it was me. That isn't the excuse I want it to be." He turned fully toward her then, And for the first time since the courtyard, she saw something in his face that was not command or calculation, but something closer to honesty. I have ruled this territory since I was young enough that most of my council still doubted I could hold it. I have learned to lead with certainty because uncertainty gets people killed. I was certain you were a threat. I was wrong, and it very nearly cost you your life. Ren considered him for a long moment, remembering the weight of his breathing beneath her palm in a shed that smelled of straw and old smoke. Remembering how strange it had felt to be trusted, wordlessly, by something so much larger than herself. "I didn't help you because I expected something back," she said finally. "I helped you because you were dying, and I have spent my whole life knowing what it feels like to be the one nobody bothers to help. I wasn't going to become that for someone else, even a wolf in the snow." Something shifted in his expression at that, quiet and unguarded, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the space between them filled with something new that neither was ready to name aloud. He reached out, slowly enough that she could have stepped back, and rested his hand over hers where it gripped the balcony rail. "Then let me be the first person in a long while," he said, "who bothers to help you back." They stood there a while longer, saying nothing further, letting the quiet do the work that words could not. Below them, torches were being lit along the training yard walls one by one, and Ren found herself thinking that this, more than the fine clothes or the grand rooms, was the first moment since Fernhollow that had actually felt like safety rather than a delay before the next disaster. Chapter 8. Whispers Beneath the Banners. Not everyone in the keep was as willing as the king to accept what had happened in that courtyard, and within days, Ren learned exactly how far some of them were prepared to go to unmake it. Magistrate Hale convened his allies in a chamber far from the king's hearing, a small circle of council lords who had spent decades shaping Ashgrave policy and had no intention of watching a commoner girl undo generations of careful order. "A bond is not a coronation," Hale told the assembled lords, his voice pitched low despite the empty corridor beyond the door. "The king may be compelled by instinct, but the court is not obligated to bend the same way. If she cannot be removed by law, she can be removed by circumstance. The blood moon hunt is in 6 days," one of the lords offered, a tradition older than the Ashgrave line itself. If something were to happen to her during it, an accident, nothing more, no one would think to question a king's grief over a mate lost to the wilds she was never suited for. Hale's expression did not change, though something in his stillness suggested the plan had already taken root. "See that it looks exactly like an accident. I want no thread that leads back to this room." One of the younger lords hesitated before agreeing, a flicker of unease crossing his face that he quickly smoothed over once Hale's gaze settled on him. Loyalty in that room, Ren would later come to understand, was rarely about conviction. It was about which side seemed less likely to lose, and for now, the magistrate's certainty made him seem like the safer wager. Ren knew nothing of that conversation, though she felt its weight in smaller ways over the following days. Cool glances from council members in the corridors, a maid dismissed without explanation for having grown too friendly with her, whispered conversations that stopped abruptly whenever she entered a room. She said nothing of it to Roan, unwilling yet to burden him with suspicions she could not prove. It was Fen who found the pendant, tucked into the lining of the old cloak Ren had worn from Fernhollow, a small silver disc etched with a crescent moon cradling a single star, a mark neither of them recognized, until an elderly keep archivist, shown the piece under careful pretense of curiosity, went pale at the sight of it. "This is the mark of the Calder line," the archivist said, voice dropping as though the walls themselves might report the words. "A pack bloodline believed wiped out during the old king's reign, decades before the current Alpha King was even born. If you carry that mark honestly, girl, you are not simply an orphan who happened to save a wounded wolf." "Then what am I?" Ren asked, though some cold, certain part of her already suspected the answer. You may be the last surviving heir of a bloodline this territory was told no longer existed, the archivist said. And there are men in this keep who have spent their entire careers making certain it stayed that way. Wren closed her hand around the pendant, feeling its edges bite into her palm, and understood, with a clarity that settled cold in her chest, that the danger she had walked into was far older and far larger than a single courtyard misunderstanding. Somewhere in this fortress, people who had buried a bloodline once before were watching her, and the blood moon hunt was only 6 days away. She did not sleep well over the nights that followed, turning the pendant over in her fingers by candlelight, half expecting the metal to offer some answer it had no way of giving. Whoever she had been born to, whatever blood ran beneath her skin, none of it changed the plain fact that she was still, in every way that mattered, the same girl who had once dragged a dying wolf home because she could not make herself walk away. She only hoped that would be enough to survive whatever the council had planned. Chapter 9. The Blood Moon. The blood moon hunt began at dusk, torches lining the forest path as nobles and pack members alike gathered for a tradition that stretched back further than the keep's oldest stones. Wren rode near the front beside Roan, the pendant hidden beneath her collar, the archivist's warning sitting heavier in her mind with every step deeper into the trees. She had told Roan everything 2 nights earlier, the pendant, the bloodline, the strange, careful distance the council had kept from her since the courtyard. He had listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening only once, when she described the archivist's warning about men who had buried her bloodline before. "Stay close to me tonight," he had told her. "Whatever happens." It was not close enough. The hunting party splintered naturally as the forest thickened, groups breaking off to follow different trails, and Wren found herself, for only a handful of minutes, separated from Roan by a stretch of dense pine and a guide who had volunteered a little too eagerly to lead her along a shortcut back to the main path. She noticed the wrongness of it almost too late. The guide's unfamiliar face among a party she had spent days memorizing, the way he kept glancing back at her rather than watching the trail ahead. By the time she opened her mouth to question him, the trees had already closed in thicker around them, cutting off the sound of the larger hunting party entirely. The attack came fast and coordinated, 3 rogue wolves breaking from the tree line with the discipline of trained soldiers rather than wild animals, driving her guide off with a single well-placed strike before turning on her. Wren scrambled backward, heart pounding, one hand closing instinctively around the pendant at her throat as though it might somehow protect her. A silver shape hit the lead wolf from the side before it could close the distance, and the forest erupted into snarling chaos. Roan fought with a ferocity Wren had not seen in him before, driving the rogues back one by one, and behind him, arriving late enough that his absence from the earlier fighting was its own kind of confession, came Doran Vex, the king's own beta, sword already drawn. "Call them off, Doran," Roan snarled, blood running from a gash along his shoulder. "Now." "They were never mine to call," Doran said, though the flicker of panic in his eyes told a different story. "I only meant to frighten her. Hale wanted it to look—" "Hale," Roan repeated, and something in his voice went very cold. "You will explain everything, from the beginning, starting with the wound that brought me to her shed in the first place." Doran's silence was answer enough. It had not been rival hunters who nearly killed Roan weeks earlier in the snow. It had been Doran himself, sabotaging his king's shift during a routine patrol, driving him wounded and half-conscious into the one stretch of forest bordering Fern Hollow, hoping the cold would finish what the ambush had not. He had not counted on an orphan girl choosing to help rather than walk away. Wren felt the ground shift beneath everything she thought she understood about how she and Roan had come to find each other. She had spent weeks believing their meeting was a simple chance, a wounded animal, and a girl too stubborn to walk past it. It had never been a chance at all. A traitor's ambition had driven Roan into her path just as surely as her own choice had kept him alive once he arrived there, and the two threads, cruelty and kindness, had been tangled together from the very first night without either of them knowing it. "You tried to kill your own king," Ren said, disbelief and fury shaking her voice. "And when that failed, you tried to kill me instead." "I did what the council asked of me," Doran said, though the words carried no real defense in them, only exhaustion at finally being caught. None of this was meant to go this far. Roan's expression held no mercy left in it. "It ends tonight," he said, "all of it," and the forest fell silent around the weight of that promise. Ren stood amid the wreckage of the ambush, breathing hard, the pendant still clenched in her fist, and watched the king she had come to know over these strange, difficult weeks give the order that would end Doran's freedom without a moment's hesitation. There was no cruelty in it, only the plain, unbending certainty of a ruler who had finally been given proof of a betrayal he must have suspected for longer than he had let himself admit. Soldiers moved to bind the fallen traitor, and somewhere beyond the tree line, the rest of the hunting party could be heard finally converging on the commotion, far too late to have changed anything that had already happened. Roan crossed the churned snow to reach her before anyone else could, his hands finding her shoulders, his eyes moving over her with the particular urgency of a man checking for wounds he was terrified of finding. "You're not hurt," he said, half questioning and half pleading, as though saying it aloud might make it more certain. "I'm not hurt," she confirmed, though her voice shook more than she wanted it to, frightened, furious. "Not hurt." He pulled her against him then, briefly, the cold forest around them fading for the space of a single breath, into something that felt, despite everything, almost peaceful. "I should never have let you out of my sight tonight," he murmured against her hair. "You didn't let anything happen," she said. Doran made his choice long before tonight. Tonight only proved it. He held her gaze a moment longer before finally releasing her, turning back toward the soldiers securing his former beta, his expression settling back into the hard, controlled lines of a king who still had a court full of conspirators to account for before the night was through. Ren watched him go, the pendant's edges still biting faintly into her palm, and understood that whatever peace tonight had bought them, it was only the beginning of setting the rest of Ashgrave right. Chapter 10. The Queen of Ashgrave. The trial that followed the Blood Moon hunt was held in the great hall of the keep, open to every noble, soldier, and servant who wished to witness it, because Roan had decided, plainly, that secrecy had already cost the territory too much. Doran Vex confessed in full, once confronted with evidence gathered from the forest and from soldiers loyal enough to Roan to speak the truth once it was safe to do so. Magistrate Hale denied everything until the pendant was laid before the court beside the old archive records confirming the Calder bloodline's mark, at which point his allies among the council, unwilling to fall with him, offered their own confessions in exchange for leniency. Ren watched the proceedings from a chair beside the throne that no one had thought to question her sitting in, and found she felt no satisfaction in watching Hale's careful composure finally crack under the weight of evidence he could not argue away. There was only a quiet, tired relief, the kind that came from finally being able to stop watching every shadow in the keep for the next threat it might be hiding. Roan's judgment was neither vague nor merciful in the way Hale might have hoped. Doran was stripped of his rank and exiled from Ashgrave lands entirely, forbidden from ever again wearing the Pack's colors. Hale, whose crimes ran deeper and colder, was removed from the council and confined under guard, his fate to be decided by a full tribunal rather than a single ruler's temper. A decision Roan made deliberately so that justice would belong to the law of Ashgrave and not simply to a king settling a personal grievance. A ruler who punishes only from anger becomes no better than the men he punishes, Roan told the hall. And Ren, standing beside him for the first time, not as a prisoner but as an equal, understood that the lesson meant as much for the watching court as for himself. With the conspiracy exposed, the matter of Ren's bloodline could no longer be dismissed as an inconvenient rumor. The Calder line, believed extinguished for a generation, lived on in her, and rather than treating that truth as a threat to be buried a second time, Roan chose to make it public, standing before the assembled court to name her not only his mate, but the rightful heir to lands that had been wrongly seized decades before his own reign began. "I will not pretend the last 2 weeks were easy," Ren told the hall, her voice steady despite the crowd of nobles watching her every word. "I did not ask to become anyone's queen. I only tried to help something wounded because I could not walk past it. If there is a lesson in any of this, it is that kindness offered without expecting anything back has a way of returning to you when you least expect it, and that the people who fear the truth the most are usually the ones with the most to lose from it coming out." In the weeks that followed, Ashgrave settled into a peace it had not known in years, the council rebuilt with lords who had proven their loyalty rather than merely inherited their seats. Ren never forgot the orphan girl who had once gathered firewood before dawn to earn her place in a miller's shed, and she made certain, quietly and without ceremony, that no child in Fernhollow would grow up as unnoticed as she once had. She sent grain before the first snow, and a standing order that any child left without family in the outer villages would be brought to the keep rather than left to fend for themselves the way she had been. It was a small thing, in the scale of a kingdom, but Ren had learned long ago that small things were often the only ones that reached the people who needed them most. On a clear evening not long after, she stood beside Roan on the same balcony where he had first apologized to her, watching torchlight spread across a kingdom that had very nearly buried her twice and had, instead, chosen to crown her. "No regrets?" he asked quietly, watching her rather than the view. "None," she said. "Every hard thing I survived brought me here. I would not trade a single winter of it, not even the coldest ones." He took her hand, and together they watched the kingdom settle into a night that finally, for the first time in a long while, held nothing to fear. If this story keeps you here until the very end, subscribe for the next one, and comment below where you're watching from. I read every single comment, and I would love to say hello and know exactly how far our story reached tonight.